The Stork Club, Manhattan, February 18, 1946. The VIP room was reserved for men who made or broke empires. Crystal chandeliers reflected the smoke from hundreds of cigars, and the polished floors echoed each careful step. Outside, the city celebrated the end of World War II, but inside, a different kind of war was about to unfold. This was a room where decisions could cost lives. And tonight, the air was thick with anticipation. Lucky Luciano entered first, a man whose name alone commanded fear and respect across the underworld. He had unified the Italian Mafia, modernized organized crime, and built an empire on exact rules and brutal efficiency. His reputation preceded him. No hesitation, no second chances, no mercy. Every move was calculated, every word measured. And yet, for all his experience, this meeting carried a danger even he had to respect. 6 of his most trusted men followed behind him: Costello, Anastasia, Lansky, and 3 of the deadliest bodyguards in New York. They were armed, alert, and trained to act without thought. And then there was Bumpy Johnson, walking in alone. No entourage, no backup, just a man, a suit, and a briefcase. The tension could be cut with a knife. Everyone in that room understood the stakes, even before a word was spoken. This wasn't a meeting. This was a test, and most men failed tests like this with their lives. Luciano's eyes scanned the room, noting the posture of each man, the tightening of jaws, the slight twitch of fingers near gun handles. The silence was deafening. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the last. Bumpy Johnson pulled out his chair and sat where the boss would normally sit, unflinching, unshaken, asserting control in a room designed for intimidation. And in that moment it was clear the night would not be decided by guns alone. World War II had ended just months earlier, and America was celebrating victory. But in the smoke-filled back rooms of Manhattan, a different kind of war was brewing. One of power, influence, and control over money that never appeared on any ledger. Lucky Luciano had served 9 years in Danora prison, but his mind never stopped working. The government had made him a deal during the war: help control the docks, keep the supply lines moving, and his sentence would be commuted. But there was a catch: deportation back to Italy within 3 weeks. Time was running out, and Luciano needed to secure his empire before he left American soil. Every piece of the Italian Mafia's puzzle was in place. Frank Costello ran the Luciano family in his absence. Vito Genovese maneuvered from Italy. Albert Anastasia controlled the docks with ruthless precision. Everything seemed ordered, stable, and untouchable. Except for one problem: Harlem. The numbers racket there wasn't just a game of chance. It was a multi-million-dollar industry thriving under Bumpy Johnson's control, and the Italians wanted in. Luciano had learned from history muscle alone wouldn't work in Harlem. Back in 1935, Dutch Schultz had tried to force his way into the business and failed. He underestimated Bumpy Johnson, and the consequences were deadly. Now, Luciano, smarter and more patient than Schultz, knew the stakes. He needed an ally, not a battlefield. The man sitting across from him was the key to controlling Harlem without shedding a drop of blood, but approaching him required respect, strategy, and restraint. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a man you could intimidate with guns or threats. His influence ran deeper than the Italians could understand, and Luciano knew this. He wasn't here to demand, he was here to offer. But the offer would test both men's cunning, patience, and understanding of power. In that room, deals would be made not by force, but by the sharpest minds in organized crime. Harlem was the last piece of the puzzle, and neither man would give an inch easily. Harlem had a memory, and it didn't forget easily. 11 years earlier, Dutch Schultz had tried to muscle his way into the numbers racket. He came in with guns, threats, and ambition, but he had underestimated the man he was challenging. Bumpy Johnson, a quiet, sharp-dressed enforcer who ran his neighborhood like a king. Schultz thought fear was enough, that violence alone could buy control over a community that trusted its own. He was wrong. Schultz's failure had been brutal and final. A New Jersey tavern became his tomb, and the story of his arrogance spread like wildfire through organized crime circles. Men learned a lesson that night. Harlem wasn't a territory to be taken by force. It was a kingdom built on trust, respect, and knowledge of its people. And the memory of Schultz's fate lingered in every decision Luciano would make that evening. Luciano understood the lesson deeply. He wasn't reckless like Schultz. He knew that to gain a foothold in Harlem, he needed more than muscle, more than guns, more than influence. He needed an agreement with the one man who controlled it all without ever raising a weapon. Bumpy Johnson was not just a gangster. He was the guardian of Harlem's economy, its trust, and its streets. And Luciano, despite his reputation, had to recognize that entering Harlem meant negotiating on Bumpy's terms. The ghost of Schultz hung over the room, unspoken but palpable. Every man present understood the stakes. History could repeat itself in blood if the wrong move was made. Luciano had studied the map of power carefully. He brought his experience, his mind, and his offer. But it would take Bumpy's permission, his respect, and his recognition to avoid a disaster that no amount of muscle could fix. The past whispered a warning. Force would fail. Patience and strategy would win. The Stork Club's VIP room waited in silence. Luciano and his 6 men already occupied their seats, exuding authority and danger. Every eye was alert, every finger near a weapon, every muscle coiled for action. And then the door opened. Bumpy Johnson walked in alone. No entourage, no backup, just a man in a tailored 3-piece suit, navy blue with a crisp white shirt, no tie. He never wore ties. A gold watch chain glinted in the low light, shoes polished to a mirror shine, hair freshly cut. In his right hand, a leather briefcase, and in his expression, the calm confidence of a man who feared nothing. The bodyguards shifted instinctively, hands hovering near their guns, but Luciano raised one finger and signaled them to hold. Let him through. Bumpy's footsteps echoed on the marble floor as he approached the table. He didn't glance at the weapons pointed in his direction. He didn't flinch at the eyes following his every move. He reached the head of the table, the seat usually reserved for the boss, and pulled out a chair, sat down, placed his briefcase carefully on the table, then lit a cigar, and waited. It wasn't disrespect, it was strategy. Bumpy was setting the terms before any words were spoken. The room, filled with men who had killed more people than they could count, held its collective breath. Even Luciano recognized what was happening. He leaned back, observing. This wasn't arrogance, it was a test. And Bumpy Johnson was proving he could set the rules in a room where rules were supposed to belong to someone else. Every subtle movement spoke volumes. Costello's jaw tightened. Anastasia's hand drifted toward his waistband. Lansky's fingers tapped lightly on the table. But Bumpy's calm remained unbroken. One man, alone, had entered the lion's den and claimed his place without a word, without a threat, without a gun drawn. And in that moment, it was clear. This night would not be about intimidation. It would be about respect, intelligence, and strategy. Luciano took the seat directly across from Bumpy Johnson. Calm, composed, the voice of a man who had negotiated with presidents and gangsters alike. Mr. Johnson, he said, thank you for coming. He folded his hands on the table, eyes steady, studying the man before him. I'm leaving the country in 3 weeks. The feds are shipping me back to Italy. But before I go, I need to make sure New York stays in order. No wars, no chaos, just business. Bumpy took a long drag from his cigar and exhaled slowly, smoke curling toward the ceiling. He nodded, said nothing. Harlem was the last piece of Luciano's puzzle, and the Italian needed Bumpy's cooperation. The numbers racket is making millions, Luciano continued, voice steady, almost conversational. My people want in, but I know you've been running things since Schultz died. You have the trust of the community, you have the infrastructure, you've got the police on your payroll. I'm not here to take what's yours, I'm here to offer a partnership. The offer was clear. Bumpy could keep running Harlem, maintain independence, and in return, the Italians would provide protection, capital, and connections, but they would take 40% of the profits. Every man at the table registered the tension. Costello leaned forward, watching reactions. Anastasia's knuckles cracked. Lansky's fingers drummed softly on the polished wood. The stakes were immense. One wrong word, one wrong gesture, and this room could erupt in bloodshed. Bumpy exhaled again, letting the smoke hang in the air like a warning. And what happens if I say no? He asked calmly, voice low, deliberate. Luciano's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. "Then we have a problem," he said, measured, lethal in his certainty. "Because if you're not with us, you're against us, and nobody survives being against us." The room fell silent. Every heartbeat was louder than the last. This wasn't anger, it was the weight of a man who had built an empire on absolute principle. Bumpy Johnson leaned back slightly, then slowly opened his leather briefcase. Inside was a collection of photographs, each one a silent warning, each one a story waiting to be told. He slid the first picture across the table toward Luciano. The Italian picked it up, fingers tightening around the edges, but his face remained calm. The photograph showed a warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn, one of Anastasia's operations, and standing in front, shaking hands with a known police captain, was Anastasia himself, taken just 3 days ago. The room went deathly quiet. Costello's hand hovered near his jacket. Anastasia half stood, knuckles whitening. Lansky paused mid-drum of his fingers. Every man in the room understood the implication. Exposure could destroy entire operations, ruin alliances, and bring law enforcement down upon them like a storm. And yet, Bumpy spoke quietly, without threat, without anger. "I've got 12 more just like this. Different warehouses, different cops, different members of your organization." Bumpy's words cut through the tension like a knife. "I'm not threatening you," he continued, calm, measured. "I'm showing you respect. I could have sent these to the district attorney, to the newspapers. I could have burned your whole operation to the ground before you even knew I had them. But I didn't." He leaned forward, eyes locked on Luciano's. "You came to Harlem asking for a partnership, but a partnership means equals. What you just offered me wasn't a partnership. It was a takeover." With a smile, Luciano studied the photographs, then Bumpy, for what felt like an eternity. For the first time that evening, the Italian appeared genuinely impressed. The room, once taut with the threat of violence, now held a new kind of tension, one born from intellect, leverage, and respect. It was no longer a question of who had the bigger gun. It was a question of who was smarter, who could survive, and who truly commanded power in Harlem. Bumpy Johnson leaned back in his chair, cigar smoke curling lazily around him, and let the weight of the room settle. He had made his point. Guns and threats didn't intimidate him. Now it was time to set the terms. "You asked for 40%, he said calmly, voice low but firm. "You can have 10. 10% of the profits, not as protection money, as a service fee." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You provide banking support. Clean money to pay winners when the heavy numbers hit. You provide legal help when our runners get arrested. In return, you get 10% of the net. That's it." The Italian shifted uneasily. 10%. That was far less than what Luciano had demanded. But Bumpy wasn't done. He leaned forward, voice dropping an octave. "And one more thing. You never, and I mean never, send your people into Harlem to collect. You want your money, send a courier to my office. I'll have it counted, wrapped, and ready. But your soldiers don't patrol my streets. Your guns don't show up in my neighborhood. Harlem stays black. Harlem stays mine." A silence like a tomb fell over the room. Even Lansky, the smoothest negotiator alive, needed a moment to process. Then, slowly, he nodded. "That's actually smart," he said. 10% for essentially no risk, no overhead, no exposure, clean money." Costello leaned back, watching, impressed. Anastasia, ever the skeptic, frowned. "And what stops him from cutting us out once the banking is set up?" he asked. Before Luciano could answer, Bumpy replied, calm, unwavering. "The same thing that stops you from taking Harlem by force. A stalemate. You try to cheat me, those photographs go public. Your political protection evaporates. I try to cheat you, you come after me. We both lose, or we both get rich. Your choice." For the first time that night, the balance of power shifted. It was no longer Luciano's room, no longer his table. Bumpy Johnson had drawn the lines. He had turned leverage into authority. And in that moment, every man understood. In Harlem, respect and brains could outweigh violence. And Bumpy Johnson was the smartest man in the room. Lucky Luciano stared at Bumpy Johnson for what felt like an eternity. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken calculations and the weight of survival. Then, slowly, Luciano started to laugh. Not a mocking laugh, but genuine amusement. "You know what, Bumpy?" he said, shaking his head. "Schultz was an idiot. He should have talked to you first." He stood up, extended his hand. and nodded toward the terms laid out on the table. 10% banking and legal support, no soldiers in Harlem, and Bumpy would deliver the money monthly. Bumpy stood and met Luciano's hand with a firm, unyielding grip. "We have a deal," he said simply. The room exhaled collectively. Frank Costello relaxed, Lansky smiled. Even Anastasia sank back into his chair, tension bleeding out like smoke from a dying fire. For the first time that night, the room was calm. The balance of power had shifted subtly but irreversibly. Bumpy had not just survived, he had dominated the negotiation without firing a single shot. Luciano held onto Bumpy's hand for an extra second, a rare gesture of respect. "Let me tell you something," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I've done business with presidents, cops, union bosses, killers. But you're the first man who came to my table and told me no without pulling a gun. That takes guts, or stupidity. I haven't decided which yet." Bumpy allowed himself a small, rare smile. It was genuine, a subtle acknowledgement of victory, of intelligence and of mutual respect. 3 weeks later, Luciano boarded a ship to Italy. He would never return to American soil, but the deal he made with Bumpy Johnson held firm for the next 22 years. The numbers racket flourished. The Italians provided banking through legitimate fronts. When Bumpy was arrested in 1951 and sent to Alcatraz, Costello personally ensured his family was cared for. And when Bumpy walked out of prison in 1963, the agreement remained intact. That handshake, that moment of calm strategy, had rewritten the rules of the underworld. In the end, the room at the Stork Club became legendary not for violence, not for threats, but for the demonstration of intellect, patience, and control. Bumpy Johnson proved that real power isn't measured by who can pull a trigger first. It's measured by who is smart enough not to. And that night, Harlem had shown the world exactly who controlled its streets. The handshake between Bumpy Johnson and Lucky Luciano didn't just end a meeting, it began a legacy. Harlem's numbers racket continued to thrive, untouched by outside muscle, carefully managed by Bumpy and his trusted lieutenants. The Italians collected their 10% quietly, providing banking support and legal assistance, but never interfering in the streets. The delicate balance of respect and power held firm for more than 2 decades. What had been a potential bloodbath became a blueprint for negotiation, strategy, and influence without violence. Even when Bumpy was arrested in 1951 and sent to Alcatraz, the arrangements remained unbroken. Frank Costello personally ensured Bumpy's family was protected, honoring the agreement made years before in that smoke-filled VIP room. When Bumpy returned in 1963, the same rules applied. Harlem stayed independent. The Italians profited, yes, but only under Bumpy's strict oversight. That meeting at the Stork Club became a whispered legend in the criminal world, not because of fear, but because of the intelligence, patience, and respect it demonstrated. Bumpy Johnson never publicly spoke about the meeting, but those close to him said he kept the photograph of Anastasia in his office for the rest of his life. Not as a threat, but as a reminder, power isn't about who fires first, who pulls a trigger, or who scares the most people. Real power is about strategy, foresight, and understanding that the smartest move is often the one that avoids unnecessary conflict. That philosophy allowed Harlem to flourish under his guidance and commanded respect from the most feared men in America. If this story of strategy, respect, and underworld diplomacy inspired you, make sure to subscribe to Bumpy Johnson Devoting Dark History, where we dive deep into untold tales of power and influence. Like the video if you believe brains can outweigh violence. Share this story with someone who needs to see how respect and intellect can command more than fear ever could. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were sitting across from Lucky Luciano that night?